Good afternoon. So nice to have all of you here. You never know what kind of a crowd you're going to get post-pandemic. I think we're still getting used to gathering, but I feel really good about this group, and I really appreciate your time on a really rainy and dismal day. Welcome to today's discussion with Eric Klinenberg, Professor of Social Science and Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. I'm Carrie Cooper, Dean of University Libraries at William & Mary and co-director of the Democracy Initiative. Today's event is part of the library's and our community's One Book, One Community program, which brings our community together for a shared reading experience. This year's book selection is Palaces for the People by Eric Klinenberg. And in his book, Eric reminds us that democracy is fortified by people coexisting together in public, and that public spaces can produce community, belonging, and unity. This book ties perfectly to our Democracy Initiative at William & Mary because we are striving to model the art of having a better argument, rekindling civil discourse, convening different perspectives and viewpoints, and advancing democratic ideals. We're not sure how to do this yet, but we're going to figure it out together. Joining us today is Shannon White from William & Mary Center for Geospatial Analysis, and she and I will be talking with Eric about his book and asking him questions submitted by our students, our faculty, and our staff. And so let's go ahead and get started. Let's welcome Eric.
So I was saying before, this is the first real-life campus visit I've done since the pandemic started. Downstairs, I asked, like, did you all have the pandemic here? Did it get to you? And something about your face mask gives it away. I really, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for this wonderful invitation. And it's not the most auspicious day to start a conversation about, rebuilding democracy. We have a war that just started a few hours ago. We have a rainstorm outside. But in a way, it all makes the conversation more urgent. And just to, putting myself in your seat for a second, I know that I personally have not gone to many live events, where there's speakers and debates. And so I guess in addition to thanking you and everyone from the team library for hosting me, I want to thank everyone on this side of the wedding just for coming out and being together, because we need to do this, right? We really need. It feels really good to be in the room. It feels a little crazy and scary a little bit, but it feels really good. So thank you all for coming despite the rain and despite all the madness in the world right now. I hope we have a good conversation.
Great. Before I get started, Shannon, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about what you do at the university? Because I think It's really great to know your background.
I am in the Center for Geospatial Analysis, which is on the second floor of the library, but we're part of Arts and Sciences. And we have an academic mission as well as a service mission, which is a beautiful blending of the library and their services alongside the academic side of teaching GIS and remote sensing and drones and things like that. We actually used your book in a class. A colleague of mine, we used the book in a community mapping class, because it has a lot of rich pieces to it. And actually my geovisualization and cartography class, their final project, they have to pick an issue that resonated from the book, and they'll be mapping it.
Oh, wow.
So those are the fun things that attach kind of to the book, but it is a nice place to be to talk about, and it's very strange to talk about things, I think, as we're moving into not necessarily post-pandemic, but endemic. So it's that off-road of pandemic into endemic, that we probably aren't ever going to be done with masks because of comfort levels and things like that. But getting together, it's important.
Yeah.
So I'll jump in
Okay.
with a really meaty first question.
Guys, don't mess around here at
I know.
old prestigious university. We're going to do it old style.
Yeah, so we have got this renewed focus at William & Mary on modeling civil discussions. And we just had lunch with a group of students who told us how hard this is, right? So in Chapter 1 of Palaces for the People, you state, spending time in public social infrastructure requires learning to deal with these differences in a civil manner. What impact do you think today's political climate has had on our ability to have civil conversations?
Not good. It's not good. It's really bad. That's the technical term we use in the social sciences. Really bad. I mean, I wrote this book in the context of a dramatically, I don't know, hostile, polarized, divided social and political situation. I mean, the book came out originally in 2018. I wrote it, mainly after the 2016 election. Do you remember that election, 2016? And I thought that election was really bad as a collective experience because it kind of brought out the worst in us. Like whether you were on the winning side or the losing side, you just felt really dirty, and not the way you feel, like not dirty in a good way, like you just played a rugby game and you're gonna have a shower and it's gonna be fine. Like it just felt bad when we looked at them in the mirror. It felt like we're in a bad situation. And so I think we, the idea for the book is to think about how do we build back from this and how do we build into something new and different. And I didn't realize when the book came out in 2018 that on top of the kind of political mess, we would also have a pandemic. I was writing about the political mess and the problem of building for a world of climate change. And now we have, if you think about what's on the table, we have kind of not just polarization, we have hostile polarization, where, I think for the first time, people who identify with one political party think that the people who identify with the other political party want to do harm to the country, right? The notion is like we're more like enemies than we are like people who have political disagreements, but we share a republic. Right? I know some of you saw both parties do this, but I was really struck on President's Day this week. You all know about Twitter? Twitter. So it's like I'm on Twitter. I go to Twitter for rich, generous discourse, and the GOP has a Twitter handle, and did anyone see this? The @GOP President's Day thing was like Happy President's Day, and it had images of 8 different Republican presidents, and then in the middle it was a picture of a photograph of Biden, and it said, not him, not you. And it was just like a weird kind of hostility to have towards another American president. I don't remember exactly that kind of spirit from back in the day. And so I think there's like this challenge of polarization. There's the deep, long-standing challenge in this country of dealing with racial inequity, racial injustice, which Black Lives Matter really brought to the forefront of our conversations during the pandemic. There's this kind of post-pandemic, I hope we get to post-pandemic. And then there's kind of in anticipation of climate change, right? So we have all of these things like mashed up together at the moment, and it makes for a really volatile situation. And we, in our conversation at lunch, we talked about just how difficult it is even to have conversations on what is a pretty comfortable and relatively protected college campus here, right? The students feeling like, even here, I don't really always feel comfortable sharing my views because I'm afraid I'm going to get attacked and stigmatized, right, and reduced to something that I'm not. And so I think the climate makes it very difficult for us generally to be honest with each other. And as an educator, I find that really challenging. And so the section that you just read from it with the question, what I say in the book is, I should take a step back because I'm presuming, if you're like most rooms I've spoken to, that not everyone has finished the book yet. I know that you've all cracked the book. I've never seen so many copies of the book as I have on this campus since I arrived. I should have brought my mother with me to campus, so I know the books are around. But when I say social infrastructure, just really, do you mind if I do this briefly?
Please.
What I mean is the physical places that shape our interactions, and it's not a metaphor. Like I think there's an infrastructure that supports social life in the same way that there's an infrastructure that supports, the flow of water or the flow of communications or the train or, the car that you drove today to get here. We have failed to recognize that our social life is built on some set of physical places. And so the argument in the book is like, if you invest in social infrastructure, if you design it well, if you build it well, if you maintain it, which is a big thing for me because I grew up in Chicago in the 1980s, and Chicago had built a lot of amazing stuff before I grew up there, and then they just kind of let it all fall apart because there was a big fiscal crisis and we didn't spend money, and so the libraries were closed and the parks had broken glass on them. So you have to maintain the places you build. And then also librarians will get this if you program it. If you program a place, then you get all kinds of returns to your collective life. And if you don't recognize social infrastructure, if you don't invest in it, you create a world where it's just nicer to sit on your couch with your phone and doom scroll because you don't feel welcome into the public sphere or the public realm. And so the specific idea is that for social infrastructure to really work well to help us build connections and even build up to having kind of difficult conversations, they need to be places that we use recurrently, right? And we need to enjoy doing it. I feel like a playground is a great example of a social infrastructure that's useful. So, any of you grew up near a playground? Have a playground? So, there's no part of the Bible in the Old Testament where it says, on the fifth day God created the playground, right? The playground it's a human invention. It's a social infrastructure that we designed, and I like to think how many relationships exist in Virginia because someone built a playground, and families, kids go to that place not because they wake up in the morning and think, what, today I'd like to go out and build some community, right? There are people who do that, but they're usually kind of weird. And you need to say, no, I mean, obviously, community building is a really big and important thing. I'm just kidding about that. But what happens is you have a playground in your neighborhood, and so you go, and you go regularly, and you're a parent, and you're pushing a swing, and you and I are pushing the same swing set, and we don't know each other, but I keep seeing you there, and at some point I look up from my phone, and we have a little conversation, And then I get a phone call, and I say, hey, would it be weird, would you mind if I run over there for a minute, and I'll be able to see, and then we go have lunch together at some point, and then you invite us to come over, and we meet your friends. Does that sound familiar? That's a thing that happens, and that doesn't happen if you don't build the playground and take care of it. So if you grow up in a place where the playground doesn't exist, think about all the relationships that don't happen. And so the argument here is we need to not just build places, but have places that we can experience in a recurrent fashion, places that we go not because we feel obligated, not because we have a project of rebuilding society, which nobody really wants to do. We just want to go to the playground, or the soccer field or the library, wherever it is. And then you build up the trust and the kind of conversations that we need to have that are difficult after that experience. And so the kind of claim in the book is that too often when we think about why we've turned out the way we turned out, we go to kind of culture. It's our values, it's our beliefs, and culture is obviously part of the story, but my argument is it's more about the relationship between the places that we build, the kind of world that we build, and those values themselves. And I believe that in a big part of American history, we actually built up public libraries, we built out public parks, we built playgrounds and schools. We went through a really generous period where we were investing in social infrastructure. We had a common project. And then we had this period starting in the 70s when we really started to retrench and pull back public investments. And then in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, it was like the market's going to give us whatever we need. We don't want to invest a lot in public institutions because good things are going to trickle down. And if you lived in an affluent place, you were fine. But if you didn't, the world started to erode around you. And we really let our social infrastructure fall apart. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're all spending all this time on our devices, which don't even make us happy. It's not just because they're really good at making us feel like we need to find out what just happened on Instagram. It's also that we stop creating a beautiful world. We didn't palaces for the people. We stopped making palaces for the people. And so the book is kind of a call for us to do that, and the hope is that this is the longest answer to your simple question.
No.
So now you got to know me a little bit, so the hope is that by building these kinds of places, we will eventually be able to change the conversation. And that's not an automatic thing. It's difficult. We can get into all the reasons it's difficult to have that, but you need to at least first have the place where you can come together. We're not going to heal the wound on Twitter.
I love the way, if I could just comment back for a minute, I love the way you connect the physical or the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure with the social infrastructure. Because I've seen a lot of academic libraries build some beautiful spaces and then forget about the program and how to engage the community in what's happening there.
Yep.
And they're not vibrant places. So I think that the social infrastructure is also, you have to be the architect of that, which sometimes is the harder part because you have to sustain the energy. Would you agree?
Yeah, so you have to, it helps to build a beautiful place.
Yeah.
But it helps even more if you build a beautiful place and then you kind of bring it to life in some way and make it inviting. And people can do that. So libraries have this built-in advantage, which they have these magical creatures called librarians, who work in them. And they do all this incredible work. I know more about, weirdly, because I've worked in universities my whole life, I actually know more about how public libraries operate than I do about how universities' libraries operate. But the program, like when Tammy showed me around here. I don't know where Tammy. There's Tammy. When we came in, the first thing we looked at was, this exhibit on Cuban film, in the basement of the library building. And then we went upstairs, and then there was another exhibit on black fraternities on campus. And then we saw this kind of special reading room, and there's the coffee shop. And there's all these ways in which a library can be programmed, or any place can be programmed. The equipment on a playground is programming, right? Now throw in a person who does that. We used to have youth job programs in the United States that were pretty generous, and teenagers routinely spent their summers working in places like playgrounds and athletic fields as kind of party starters, And they were there to kind of get people and we just kind of gave up on that stuff. So building it is one thing, but you could build a really beautiful place and then kind of wall it off and not have it be accessible at all. In fact, we do that often. And then it could be a place to see, but it doesn't work as social infrastructure. So if you can build a physical place and then also program it, now you really have potential. Does that resonate with the way you think about space?
Yeah, the space and the place are very much tied to the activities that are taking place there. And that's true across geographies. I know one of the questions that a lot of folks were asking this is so focused on urban, that does this kind of resonate in rural or does this resonate in global? But I think that there are some other, and we can talk about that as well. But I think that there's some really interesting things that have happened in the past couple of years that kind of lead into that heavy part that we have to still have the conversations, and sometimes the programs lead those conversations, right? We don't always talk about race. We don't always talk about difference unless someone starts that conversation. And librarians actually do a really great job of starting those conversations by bringing authors in, by offering opportunities. And it's interesting because, I don't want to go from playgrounds to really super deep, but I think it's important that we think about playgrounds in different scenarios. I think of two little girls that I worked with in Missouri that they had a parent that was incarcerated, and when I talked to them about playgrounds and parks, they were scary places to them because they hadn't been maintained, and that's part of that cycle piece of it that we have to make sure that it's maintained. And that's going to lead me into the deep question of, in the chapter Common Ground, you really do talk about those weighty topics of race, of class, and of politics, but I think the bigger question is, how does social infrastructure that we build and support, that's the important part, support it, how do we build that to not reinforce institutional racism? I know, I'm sorry.
Are we allowed to talk about racism at a public university? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, there's like the issue about, where you can speak and how,
Right.
And so that today, when I picked up the New York Times, there was an article, an op-ed in the New York Times about the problem of woke librarians. And it was like, it's the fight for the soul of the library. And I was like, ooh, the soul of the library, what's that going to be about? Like, I spent so much time in libraries, and basically, that is not the soul. That's not the problem with the soul of the library right now, woke librarians. That was like someone's delusional fantasy, I thought. Like the soul of the library is like, who's gonna pay to build basic infrastructure so you can have like bathrooms and heat and air conditioning and just pay to have the staffing for a library. So I'm glad we can have an open conversation about race and racial inequity because it's a big issue. And so I said before I was from Chicago, and I should say about Chicago's investment in social infrastructure in the time before I was born, that it was literally built to segregate the city. So like highways were built to divide black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, and then the playgrounds and branch libraries and parks that were built were not built like with the written intent to organize separate segregated spaces for black people and white people, but that is the manifest effect that they had on the city because segregation was built into the urban plans, and Chicago was able to use federal funds to resegregate, intensify segregation in the city. So when I think about finding common ground, it's looking for places that are on edges and places that will be accessible and welcoming to different kinds of people. Because it seems to me like I could say that Chicago is, 35% white and 35% black and, 25% Latino and 5% Asian, and that would sound like a really diverse city. But then if I took you into Chicago and you were like, oh, every one of those groups lives in its own place, it doesn't feel segregated. So how do you, it's not perfectly segregated, but it's a very segregated city, as most or many American cities are. So as you know, in this book I write a lot about libraries. One of the things I really like about libraries is that libraries have this extraordinary capacity to attract people from different walks of life. Of course, if you build a library in a super segregated neighborhood where there's not a lot of traffic from people in different places, the library will feel very segregated too. But there are a lot of places where you can build a library in a location such that it does operate a little bit like a magnet. And libraries are amazing in that they attract people not just from different ethnic groups or racial backgrounds, but also different class groups, different ages, different languages, some citizens, some non-citizens. They're really kind of amazing blends of people. And then the question becomes, is there something the libraries can do to program themselves so you don't have that's the room where you find unhoused people, that's the room where you have the kids, and that's another set of issues. In the book I write about sports fields. I'm a soccer dad, and I grew up as an athlete playing a lot of sports, and I just talked about this a little bit with the students downstairs, or in another building, but athletic fields can be kind of interesting places where you go not because you're in search of community, you go because you want to see your child play, but you often wind up on a field with a bunch of people who are from different backgrounds. That's not true if it's like a pay-to-play system, which is a part of the problem with American youth sports culture, where, if you're in the soccer league where it costs $5,000 a family, that's going to be a less diverse and inclusive space than the open, more public one. But there are all kinds of places that can foster connection across group lines. And again, I just want to say, location matters, the context matters. If you live in a hyper-segregated city, it's much less likely that you're going to have an integrated public space, and programming is huge here, right? Because when you do live in a divided society, it's the staff that has the best capacity to find ways to bring people together. We will follow all the prompts that we've been given in our social life. And so if our urban design, our politics, our collective life, our media tells us you should be separate, you belong to separate categories, we're going to follow that. So we actually have to kind of undo some of that work.
Yeah. I like the idea of edges. We don't talk about that enough. I think we do think of spaces as this or that, and not this and that.
So, so I teach at New York University, and New York University has no fences or walls. You know, it's kind of bleeds into the city. Our campus is a public park, Washington Square Park. And there's a university to the north of us, you know, that rhymes with Columbia. And, you know, it's a fine institution, but it's like, it's got big gates around it. And, you know, its relationship with, you know, NYU's got an awkward relationship now with the Greenwich Village because NYU has, you know, exploded and become big and rich. And, you know, some people are resentful of all the stuff that NYU brings into the neighborhood, but like, there's a long history of universities in this country, and I write about this in the book, that, you know, that really separate themselves from the communities around them. Like, they potentially have a lot to give, and they make it really clear that some people are welcome here, and other people are most definitely not. You know, other people are most definitely not. And that's a missed opportunity, not just for the people who live around universities who could potentially gain from the cultural richness, but from the universities that have failed to take seriously the lived experience of people who are around universities and failed to deal with the contradiction between the mission of the university as a place for, you know, social mobility and for kind of these kind of liberal, small L kind of engagements with difference, and turn themselves into zones of exclusivity. And this is not easy to do, but it's something that's essential. And I don't know, I mean, I know that some universities are better than others at doing this, but I think all universities have work to do.
I think it's one of the reasons we do this One Book, One Community is because we were trying to find ways to engage with the community of James City County and Williamsburg with William and Mary. But as you look around the room, you mostly see William and Mary people here. And tonight, you'll probably mostly see the Williamsburg, James City County group. It is really, I mean, we've been doing this now, I think this is our 4th year, picking a book together with our community to try to have a shared reading experience, but we still are finding it hard to figure out how to get our community and the students together to have the conversation that we want to have. It's hard.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's a miracle that anyone's here in the physical room at all right now. So I'm just like, I'm happy there's somebody in the room with us. It's like, we're not good. We're just getting our feedback, right? I mean, we're just kind of like figuring out how to do this again. And we're doing it with some trepidation. But you're right. I mean, we like things that make us feel comfortable. And it's, you know, like we've been forced into this zone of horrible discomfort these last couple of years. And I think that's partly because we're smashing into reality that we have been in denial of for a long time. Like, you know, we have had a kind of will not to know about these things that were all around us, and they're all kind of crashing, and it feels very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You know, it's a very uncomfortable time. You know, but now the question is there some way that we can recognize what we get from the conversations with people who aren't normally in the room with us? First, we got to get in the room. So now, like this day one, we're in a room. That's good. The good piece of progress. And now it's like, how do we mix up the room a little bit? And I think it's coming.
So you wrote this book before the pandemic, and now that you can reflect on what's happened the last 2 years, how has the pandemic shaped your views on social infrastructure?
Well, you know, this is a book about like how do you build gathering places, and basically we didn't want gathering places the last couple of years because you know, suddenly gathering became dangerous. But in some ways, I think the pandemic experience has made me appreciate the power and value of social infrastructure even more than I did before. Like, you know, why have these last few years been so difficult and stressful? Well, for a while because we all thought we were going to die. But then it became because we're just sitting around our apartments, our houses on our screens, and we're going nuts because we're bored. We miss each other. We miss other people. We miss our friends. We miss strangers. Like I did this big study of people who are living alone in New York, and basically people miss just being around other people. Like they miss the random people they don't even know who always are at the coffee shop, or at the gym. Just having the sense of being in the world together with other people is really fundamental to our sense of who we are. So, I think there's a great sociological concept that comes from this guy Emile Durkheim, who's one of the founding figures in sociology, and the concept is collective effervescence. And when Durkheim said collective effervescence, he means like that moment where you're with a lot of other people, and you kind of create this situation where there's this like, I don't know, kind of like euphoric feeling of joy, like this sense that, we're kind of bubbling with collective energy and life, like kind of effervescence. Like if you go to a sports match and something great happens, you have this moment of collective effervescence. He wrote about it in the context of religious rituals, like you can sometimes feel it. Dance club, going to a concert, really great sociology lectures, obviously. So I think we missed, like we really missed that. We have not had a lot of occasions the last couple of years for collective effervescence. We're just like, we don't have that. And it's one of the joys of being alive is to have those moments where it just feels great to be with each other. And you can't produce collective effervescence by yourself, in your living room. No matter how good that show is on Netflix, it doesn't get you to collective effervescence. And so I think one thing about the pandemic is I think it's made a lot of us appreciate that we took for granted public places, public life, the kind of gathering places where, we could be part of something that was bigger than ourselves, or even bigger than our families. And now I think the question is, how do we build those in a way that works? Sometimes the infectious disease is so dangerous that we just don't want to avoid each other. We don't want to be in those places. But most of the time, I hope for most of the rest of our lives, we're going to be able to be together. And we want to think about how we can do it better.
Thanks. Shit.
It's kind of interesting because the students in my class, I know there's a generational change. Lindsay, one of my fellows, reminded me that I started my career when the year she was born. And so I have these moments where I'm like, oh yeah, I've been doing mapping for as long as you've been alive. And I think there's a generational gap sometimes that can occur in the perception, because I don't always think of the technology as community building, even though I have a background in instructional technology. I have a passion for technology. Lately, not as much. I think it is post-pandemic. Mm-hmm. But they were arguing that there was community, and there are vibrant communities that are digital, and how that same concept of social infrastructure with the physical, is it translatable into the digital? And I think that's important to a lot of people who are, I think about little ones that pick up the digital from a very young age, and they see it as just a part of their lives, whereas there's a whole other set of people who didn't have it all of their lives. And that conversation gap that needs to happen. So how does that fit where, you have the group of gamers, or the group of people who get together and cook together?
Yep. So I'm not a Luddite on this. Like, you will find me on Twitter saying stupid things like everybody else, trying to be funny, not being funny, just like in real life. And, I use social media. I see lots of value in social media. I wrote a book about online dating. I get all the ways also in which like younger people kind of layer physical face-to-face life with their phone life. I have a middle school daughter and a high school son, and I see them like with their friends together hanging out, but with their phones out, and they're, triangulating between these things in a way that's like, people in my generation don't do as much. For us, it's an either-or proposition. So I'm not like against social media or communications infrastructure that helps us connect, but a couple things. I think at this point, it's kind of indisputable that the algorithms that shape our social media are dividing us, and they're organized by the dominant providers in this, in the field to be divisive and to push extreme points of view because they know that that gets our attention. And so the net effect of living in Facebook world is that, we get exposed to very divisive, extreme positions, and we get sorted that way. And my understanding is that's like and it plays out in political crises of all kind, from American electoral politics to the situation right now in Ukraine and Russia, right? I mean, it's really social media is an incredible tool for division. But the other thing I would say is that as much as I appreciate the way we can connect with friends and family, my kids got to FaceTime and Skype their grandparents during the pandemic, and otherwise I wouldn't have seen them for years. And I got to teach my classes on Zoom, and Zoom sucks, but Zoom's better than being unemployed. So that, right? So I appreciate all that stuff. But like, if to the people who said like, oh, sometimes people say, oh, you don't understand, the face-to-face is one kind of social life, but face-to-screen's another, and they're really just like, they're just two different things, and one's not better than the other. If I said to you, like, okay, I have bad news, we're going to take away all of your social media, and you're not going to be able to use Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat, or TikTok, you would be sad. That'd be hard. You'd miss them for a little bit. But my guess is that kind of we would find a way to get over the pain of that. But if I said to you today, and this is like a plausible thing that one could say, like, I have really bad news. It turns out they've just discovered a new mutation in the coronavirus and COVID-19, and now the next wave that's going to come through, like 85% of people of all ages who get it are going to die, and it's going to last, forever. And so basically, from now on, we're not going to be able to come together in person in physical life. We're not going to be able to be in rooms together. You're basically like, we're going to be okay, but the way we're going to survive is we're all just going to go be in our rooms, and we're going to be on our computers. Like, social life is going to be online basically forever. We would be so depressed and miserable about that. Like, there's no getting over that. You know what I mean? That's like, if I told you, like, or even if I said not forever, but like for 2 more years, we're now going to have to go inside, and there's going to be no in-person anything, we would be so depressed. It would be the worst possible thing that I could tell you right now. Worse than almost anything would be that. And the reason is because it's different to be together face to face. It's different to be actually physically present with one another. And I actually think that it's in that situation, like facing the prospective loss of one of those two things. Sure, there's some people who'd be like, oh, I don't care about actual face-to-face. I don't really like to be with people. I'd rather just do my multiplayer game, like massively online, whatever thing, game. I grant that there are people like that, but I think most of us really, really value, in a way that kind of goes beyond our capacity to express, being with other people, face-to-face, in real life. And I don't think there's any comparison. So my view, social media is a great supplement to social life, but social media is not a substitute for social life. And in too many cases, it becomes a substitute.
So a little bit building on some things we've talked about. You've talked about the algorithms and how we are all going back to the few sources that we trust, and mainly those sources are agreeable to our own political viewpoints and perspectives. So how important is it that we put ourselves in situations that are uncomfortable?
Well, I mean, I think it's super important, but not uncomfortable for the sake of being uncomfortable. Like, there's certain rooms that are uncomfortable because they're hostile and dangerous. And
Yep.
I don't want anybody in that room.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just, I'm not, there, like, we live in a time when there are actually people who are hostile and dangerous. I mean, there was a war that got started a few hours ago, through hostility and danger. And I can think of, like, I don't, there's a lot of stuff I don't want to expose my students to for the sake of making them uncomfortable in a productive way. Like, they don't need to be around a white supremacist,
Yeah.
you know? And there's organized white supremacist movements, like, at work in the United States. So there's a caravan that's leaving Los Angeles for Washington, D.C., and I think some of them are protesting the excesses, the so-called excesses of the COVID thing, but some of them are flying Confederate flags. So, you know, I don't think I need to expose my students to white supremacists. I like, when I saw the, I see statements from people sometimes that just seem like hostile and violent and terrible. But I do think someone should be able to hear someone from a different political, like, imagine that you're a Democrat on a college campus and you're a student. I think you should be able to be in a room with someone who says, I'm really worried that all of these mask mandates are going to be hard for kids, and they're not seeing the faces of their teachers, and they're not developing language skills, and their social interactions are not developing the way we want them to, and there's a trade-off between, you know, health and the child psychological development and social development, and I think we've gone too far in that direction, you know. Now, we usually don't talk that politely, but, you know, but like that seems to me like a legitimate position to be debated. We should be able to have a debate about that. Like they're trade-offs, like this, right? And so,
And you're talking about building trust in social infrastructure,
yeah,
building a trusting environment?
yeah, I mean, I think, and again, I think what I said earlier today is, you know, if you get a bunch of people together who are from different political sides, and you start with like a conversation, like who's better, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, you know, that's going to be a really terrible conversation, you know. But there are ways to build up to difficult conversations, and like universities need to be hosting difficult conversations. Like our classrooms need to be hosting difficult conversations. I struggle so much with these like kind of assaults on learning in college environments where people talk as if like college campuses are full of woke professors and woke librarians who are forcing their students to take a certain position or get out. Like, that's never been my experience, you know. I went to Brown, Berkeley, and NYU, so I'm like as ideologically, you know, in one direction as possible, but like the classroom is a place where you have honest discussions and you know, are open to different viewpoints, right? So you know, we need to create forums where people can be exposed to, you know, arguments that they don't already agree with. If not, I was saying this to a student before, because we've gotten really bad at the art of persuasion and argument and rhetoric. Like, people, you know, the way to get, if you believe something, some policy position, say, you know, the way to promote that position in the world is not to tell everybody who disagrees with you that they're stupid, you know, and that you're better than them and they don't know what they're talking about. Like, you have to learn how to make a connection and to make an appeal, right, and bring them around. That's rhetoric, that's evidence. Sometimes that's about the art of conversation, you know? Like, you want to be able to build a rapport with someone so that they can hear you. Sometimes I think we're in a situation right now where the only way that we can kind of get through our divisions is to find ways to break down the kind of protection that we've all had to build to deal with people who disagree with us. Like, we have to find some ways to get that human connection. And that's another reason I'm such a big advocate for building, you know, physical places that can do that. I think like we need to find some way to rehumanize people who disagree with us. That's a very low goal in life, right? I mean, like, it's very modest to think.
Yeah.
You know, we need to find a way to recognize our common humanity. But when I look at the American kind of political discourse, and it's not just the U.S., I mean, this is really a trend in the world, I think like that's unfortunately where we are.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, it's interesting because you think about, you know, the first time I went home from college, you know, and disagreed with my parents because I had learned something new and thought I knew everything, right? There's a lot to be said for that, but then there's also this advocacy piece, and I think that we want to hear from you if there are people who really think that social infrastructure might be counterintuitive to them, how do you then advocate into that space of, we know this can help. I mean, those who live in libraries, those who go to parks, but how do we advocate for that particular improvement?
Yeah. So two things on that. One is, first, we don't have so when I wrote the book, social infrastructure was not a concept. Like I had to define it, and now it's kind of wild because this weird story where when my book came out, there was this review in the New York Times from a mayor of a small town in Indiana called Pete Buttigieg, and I was so pissed off when this review came out because I was like, who is this nobody? Why couldn't they get a serious person to review my book? I mean, it's the New York Times, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Whoops, got that one wrong. So now this guy is the Secretary of Transportation, and he's championing social infrastructure. So, hats off to the New York Times book review editors. That's like part of the conversation, which is wild. But I guess first, we still have to explain what social infrastructure is, because it's still not a concept that's really familiar to people. And then I think some people just think, oh, the library is obsolete. The library is like this 19th century institution, and it's for quiet rooms with quiet people reading books that nobody cares about. And the fact is, the library today is very different than the library was. And a lot of people just need to come in. And the way to do it is to get people to come into the library. I say this when I give talks to champions for libraries. I don't know if I'm talking tonight sometimes there'll be a foundation that supports the library, and people want to know, well, what can we do to increase public support and political support? It's find 10 friends, who don't go to the library, and just take them here, and spend an hour here together, do something. People don't realize all the stuff that's happening in some of these public spaces. And then I think, so there's exposure.
Right.
And then there's another thing, which is social infrastructure is now a little bit like climate change in that when people know about it, and most Americans now believe in climate change, we know it's happening, even across political parties, we believe it's happening, but it feels less urgent than other things. So the problem with social infrastructure investment is even people who recognize that a library is a really good thing feel like it's less important to build parks and playgrounds and libraries and than it is to do something else. More money for the police or more money for whatever it is that you want. So then the question is how do you evince the importance of these places, and how do you show that they really do investing in them really does make an impact? And that's when you give them my book.
Shameless plug.
That answers all the questions.
I will say that I've been using the term social infrastructure.
Do you still get invited to parties?
I
And
do.
stuff?
I do. My latest. Some people in the room will know that we're building a digital research lab in the library, and we're also renovating the ground floor to build a studio for teaching and learning innovation. And what I recently told my dean colleagues and administrative colleagues is the thing that both projects have in common is we're building social infrastructure for the institution. We're building social infrastructure for the faculty who work in an office and a department, sometimes don't see people from other departments. We do not have a faculty club. We are trying to build a destination to talk about teaching and learning. Same thing for the digital research lab. We want to build social infrastructure and a place for people to come together to work on digital projects, which
It's great.
sounds, so it's, I like the term, and I appreciate having some new language to use.
All right.
Yeah.
Can we go now? We done?
No,
Yeah,
no,
okay,
no,
that
no,
was
no.
such a good note to end on. It's drop the mic.
I got one last
No,
question.
I'm just kidding. I'm
One
in no rush. I just
No,
said that.
one last
I
question.
Good
promise
ending
to-
line. Thank you very much. I'll be back.
I was going to end with, and then we can open it up if there's time for a question or two. What are you most hopeful about for the improvement of social infrastructure and social health?
Well, I mean, the most hopeful thing is that it's really on the agenda. I mean, it got beaten back to senators who wouldn't vote for it, but we had a $1.5 trillion bill that almost became law that had massive amounts of money for social infrastructure. And that was just inconceivable 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Like, it's amazing, it's stunning. And I don't think we're going to get the 1.5 trillion, but I do think that at some point we will have a really significant investment in social infrastructure. And already some of the infrastructure spending that we've committed to, even before that bill, is up and running. There's all this money for climate resilience, and in the book I read a lot about how you can build social infrastructure into climate security projects, climate adaptation projects. That's a big passion of mine. And some of that stuff is happening already. So I think, like, it is inevitable that we are going to spend a huge amount of money on new infrastructure. We have to, because our infrastructure is basically built for another planet. You know, we live on a different planet now, fundamentally. We're no longer in the Holocene. We live in the Anthropocene. And there's climate instability where there used to be stability, instability where there used to be stability, and we have all these systems and structures that literally don't work. And so we have to spend money. And if we can think about social infrastructure as we build other things, including like a seawall, you know, instead of just building a simple wall, you can build a wall that's like topped with a park, and it functions much better for making a better society, in addition to making a more secure one. So I'm hopeful because I see a lot of really good things happening.
Great. So we were not built to walk around with a microphone, but if you'll be loud when you ask your question, we can repeat it if we need to, but I'd love to open it up if you have questions.
So I actually have done some research with the CGA People Fellows this past semester and this semester on the effect of social infrastructure, specifically in Medellin, Colombia. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how the effect or the approach to social infrastructure from, you know, a policy perspective or anything else would be different when you look at, you know, a developing country as opposed to, you know, of course your book focuses on the United States.
I'm going to repeat it.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
Yeah.
Just for recording purposes, the question was from Aiden, who is doing research in Medellin, Colombia, around the very similar topics having to do with the subject of this book, and so how does that translate over into developing nations?
Yeah, so it's a really important question, and I guess the first thing I would say is that there's not just a developed nation distinction to make. There's distinction to make at every neighborhood, every city. When you're going to build social infrastructure, you want to do it by working with the local stakeholders, and you want to understand how people use the physical space they have already, what their kind of cultural practices are, the local values are, where they have strengths and where they have weaknesses, right? That you never want to design social infrastructure as like the brilliant architect or engineer from up on high who comes in a place and says, here's what you need to be modern, which is how a lot of development used to happen. So in this Rebuild by Design competition that I was the research director for under the Obama administration, we had a 9-month process before any design team could submit a plan that involved research and also a huge amount of local participation in the design process, and in the site selection process. So you always want to have your ear to the ground if you're thinking about, what kind of social infrastructure to make. In a lot of developing societies, crowding is more of an issue than isolation, right? There's a kind of a lack of privacy. More people per room in a house, tight public spaces so that people are kind of densely packed together, and so the needs of a city or neighborhood are different. And I don't know Medellin well enough to know, but like if you're going to build a field there, like you don't want to have goalposts for American football, you want to make sure it's a soccer field, right? So like the most basic things, like you just want to be attentive to the kinds of things that people use. That said, like there are certain kinds of certain physical forms that really work well across society. So for instance, again, to go back to my kind of favorite social infrastructure, a local library is potentially a really important place in a society, in Medellin, because because of its capacity for inclusivity, for radical inclusivity. In a lot of developing nations, inequality is a profound problem. So you have like a very wealthy class of people living in good neighborhoods, sometimes gated neighborhoods with high-end institutions, and a lot of the development is for them. And so what could be a shared space turns out to be an exclusive space. So can you build a library that is inclusive and welcoming, that dignifies poor people? And then if you have people who are poor, what are the kinds of resources you would have in a public space that would be especially useful? So like, is it more bathrooms? Is it cleaning facilities? Like I was in this incredible new library in Helsinki, Finland before the pandemic called the Uda Library, which is this amazing, amazing spaceship of a place. And like they have showers in the basement, like the basement's set up to be a place that's used by poor people also. So, you think about those kinds of uses. So have your ear to the ground, I guess. There's a question over here.
Hi, my name's Olivia. I work in the library, obviously. You're outside. I am really interested in how we get people. Okay, so I feel like a lot of people sort of opt out of their public spaces. Like, I'm going to send my kids to the private school because it's maybe it's better. I'm going to go to this park on the other side of town that doesn't close to my house because it's nicer. I'm going to put my kids on the travel team for soccer because this league is. How do I convince my friends to come back into the public spaces instead of opting out because they have needs?
Do you want,
Yeah.
do you want me to repeat that one?
Yeah.
So Libby's asking a question about, for those who have the means to opt out of public spaces, how do you encourage them to opt back in and forego paying for travel teams or private anything?
Private anything, yeah.
Private anything.
Right. So I think you're naming one of the really big problems in the United States in particular, which is that we pulled so much support from the public realm and from public institutions that they stopped performing at the level that they needed to retain this kind of support and interest of elites, and in some cases of middle-class people as well. And so we created a world where it was like, you don't need to go to the library because you have Starbucks, and you can get your book on your Kindle and sit in Starbucks. And then the Starbucks weren't nice enough, and now we have coffee shops that are like, you have to pay $8 for a cappuccino, and they don't take cash, by the way. You can only go to the, I'm not kidding, Come visit me in New York sometime. Like, there's all these coffee shops, and like, they don't take cash. You try to pay, no, sorry, we don't take cash. We only take, so you can only come in if you have a credit card, right? And of course, like, what happened when the Supreme Court told municipalities around the United States that they couldn't have segregated swimming pools anymore? Country clubs happened, private pools happened, right? Like, we have ways of saying like, oh, well, if, we don't make the public sector work in the way that I want it to, then I'm going to retreat. So I think the baseline thing is we have to invest enough in the public's realm that it's decent, It has to be good, right? We have to have a good public realm. So like, again, like speaking as a kid from Chicago, when the playgrounds had broken glass, we stopped going to the playgrounds. When the public school system in Chicago was called the worst public school system in the nation when I was growing up, and my parents, like, my cousins all moved to the suburbs. My parents were like, we're staying in the city. And then they had a fight where, like, one of my parents said, we're going to send our kids to public school, and the other said, no, we're going to the suburbs. If you want to do that, we're either going to do city and private school because the public schools were so bad. And so the first thing is, like, we need to make the public realm good enough. And right, that and we really failed to do that. Like, we're having this debate in New York City right now about access to the kind of higher tier of public schools. There's all these schools you have to test into in New York. It's like a big national story. And why does everyone care so much about their kid getting into one of these super exclusive, testing, like test eligible public schools? Because the regular public schools are not as good as they should be. And so that the stakes of that are really high. So in America, the problem we have with all these things is that we have massive inequality here, and people feel this like baseline of insecurity, and you don't know if you're going to get on the other side of that mountain, right? And so you have to invest everything possible, to try to get to the other side of the mountain so you can get some security, and right. So like, so we're all like investing a lot because we're afraid that we're going to get dumped into this crappy public realm. So I think like we have to elevate the base. I think we have to have much better institutions to do that. And then I would say, and I'd like that's a very ambitious goal, right? That's a very, very ambitious goal. But like there are places that do that better than others. There are places that invest more in public libraries and public parks and public schools and improve that. And then the other thing I was going to say is that what I often tell people, about the value of going to the library specifically is that, in a way, like the library is your collective reality principle. Like you walk into a library and you can figure out what kind of place you're in and what's actually happening, where you are. The public institutions tell us something about who we are. They force us to be honest with ourselves. Right? We can see into ourselves in a much deeper way. And I think one of the lessons of the last several years is that our denial of reality is pretty dangerous. Like if we deny the issues that we're trying to suppress, they come back and bite us. And so there's a value in being in touch with what's actually happening where you live. And public institutions have a way of expressing that as well. You can't hide from who you are. So there's not an easy answer to your question, as you know, but that's how I would think about it.
So I think we are about 5 minutes over the advertised end, so I'm gonna stop us. But join me in thanking Eric for being with us today.
Thank you.